What if the person you loved most in this world wasn't simply your family, but truly the other half of your soul? What if nature itself made a quiet, terrible mistake, splitting one being into two bodies and leaving them to wander the earth aching to be whole in ways the rest of us can barely imagine? High in the Appalachian mountains, where the morning mist never fully lifts, and the hollows keep secrets darker than the coal, buried deep below, there are whispers of twins who challenge every belief we hold about love, about blood, and about the fragile borders of human connection. Before we sink into their story, take a breath with me. If dark family legends and the shadowy edges of human nature fascinate you, press the like button, subscribe to Sleepy History Tales, and tell us, where in the world are you listening tonight? What time glows on your clock as these words reach you? Are you ready to wonder whether some bloodlines were never meant to continue? Then settle in. Let the night hold you. Our journey begins. Cedar Hollow, Kentucky. 1931. The most hidden valley in all the Appalachians. A place where the road ended 10 miles before the first cabin, and where fog rolled so heavy across the trees it seemed to swallow sound itself. It was here in a small log house built by hands, long returned to dust, that Agnes Whitaker released her final breath as she delivered something the mountains were not prepared to receive. Twins. But not ordinary twins. Hattie Coleman, the mountain midwife who had caught hundreds of babies in her 60 long years, dropped her instruments the instant she saw them. A boy and a girl, yet identical in every feature that mattered. The same sharp little nose, the same wheat-colored hair, the same storm-gray eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. Even the birthmark, a tiny crescent moon, rested on the same spot of each small left shoulder. Devil's mirrors. Hattie breathed, her hands trembling as she wiped the newborns clean. I've seen twins before, but never like these. They ain't meant to look alike when one's a boy and one's a girl. It ain't natural. Beside the bed, Thomas Whitaker, coal miner. His skin forever shadowed with black dust, clutched the cooling hand of his wife, who had bled far too long for anyone to save. Her last words were barely more than a sigh. Keep them together, Thomas. One soul, promise me. He named them Eliza and Elijah, old mountain names drawn from scripture. And from the very first heartbeat, they unsettled every living soul around them. When Hattie tried to place the infants in separate baskets, they shrieked until their faces turned purple. Their cries rose so perfectly in unison, it was as though a single voice echoed through two tiny throats. Only when their hands found each other did they fall silent. As the weeks slid by, Thomas noticed details that chilled his blood. When Eliza grew hungry, Elijah's stomach rumbled. When a mosquito bit Elijah's arm, Eliza scratched the same place on her own skin. They breathed together, blinked together, turned their heads as if pulled by one invisible string. Neighbors began to whisper. Some remembered tales from Thomas's grandmother, stories of twins in the Whitaker line who were too close. Others simply crossed themselves when they glimpsed the children, their matching gray eyes tracking movement with an intelligence far beyond their months. By winter, Thomas had grown gaunt from sleepless nights watching over the pair who seemed less like two children and more like one consciousness exploring itself in duplicate. Years passed through Cedar Hollow like water through cupped hands. Each season slipped away, And still, the twins remained a riddle the mountain could not solve. By 6 years old, Eliza and Elijah spoke a language that belonged only to them. Not the playful nonsense of ordinary children, but a flowing pattern of sounds that rose and fell like mountain streams, precise and complete. Down the mountain, 5 miles of rough path away, stood the one-room schoolhouse where Miss Catherine Donnelly taught all 8 grades beneath a single creaking roof. Thomas had prayed that school might give the children separate identities, might loosen the invisible cord between them. He was wrong. On their very first day, Miss Donnelly placed the twins on opposite sides of the room. Within an hour, she looked up to find them seated side by side, though no one had seen them move. "How did you get here?" she asked Elijah, astonished. And then, as though sharing a single thought, both children answered together, voices soft and perfectly matched. "I was always here." Their grey eyes did not blink. And for the first time, Miss Donnelly felt the hush of the mountain settle inside the little schoolhouse. A hush that carried the uneasy question Cedar Hollow would never stop asking. Were Eliza and Elijah 2 lives, or just one soul split by mistake, searching for the way back to itself? The incident that ended their schooling arrived quietly, 3 weeks after that strange first day. Miss Donnelly had given her students a simple assignment, an essay describing what each child hoped to become when they grew up. She kept a watchful eye as Eliza and Elijah bent over their separate desks, her gaze moving back and forth to be sure no secret glances passed between them. They wrote in silence, backs straight pencils scratching softly against the worn wood of the schoolhouse. When Miss Donnelly gathered the papers, a shiver climbed her spine. Not only were the essays identical word for word, but the handwriting was perfectly matched, each curve of a letter, each crossed T and dotted I a flawless mirror. "This ain't possible," she whispered that evening to Thomas Whitaker, spreading the pages beneath the dim glow of a kerosene lamp. They couldn't have cheated. I watched them every second. It's as if they share the same mind. From that day forward, the twins stayed home. Thomas, who could barely read himself, tried to guide their lessons. But it was soon clear they needed no teacher. Somehow they taught each other. Elijah grasped arithmetic after Eliza studied it alone. Eliza recited Bible verses she had never once seen on the page, but Elijah had read. Knowledge moved between them, like breath unseen, unstoppable. It was during their 10th winter that Thomas, worn thin by drink, and dread made a desperate choice. The twins had taken to sleeping in the same bed, curled together like puppies, their breathing a perfect rhythm. No matter how many locks he set or how carefully he separated them, he always woke to find them, side by morning, hoping to bring a kind of ordinary order into the house. Thomas married Constance Murphy, a widow from the next hollow with 3 children of her own. Constance was a practical woman hardened by loss, a survivor who knew how to keep a home. Thomas prayed she might teach the twins what it meant to be separate people. Constance lasted 6 months. The breaking point came on a moonless August night. Rising to use the outhouse, she passed the twins' room and heard voices. Peering through the narrow crack of the door, she froze. Eliza and Elijah sat in total darkness, hands stretched across the gap between their beds, fingers interlaced. They spoke in unison, not in English, not in the strange private language Miss Donnelly had once heard, but in something older, a sound that made Constance's teeth ache. "The moon knows our names," the twins whispered together. "The mountain remembers when we were one." Mother's blood sealed the splitting. Father's fear feeds the separation. Constance packed before dawn. Before leaving, she seized Thomas by his whiskey-stained shirt and hissed her warning. "Those ain't children, Thomas. There's something else wearing children's faces. I've seen animals birthed wrong that lived longer than they should. That's what you got there, something that shouldn't be, but is anyway." When morning came, Thomas found the twins already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a breakfast no one remembered cooking. They looked at him with their storm-grey eyes and spoke as one. "She was never meant to stay, Father. We are complete in ourselves." The summer of 1945 settled over Cedar Hollow with a heat so heavy it made the air shimmer like water. Eliza and Elijah, now 14, had grown into perfect reflections despite their different sexes. The same angular cheekbones, the same storm-grey eyes, the same subtle tilt of the head when listening. Neighbors who caught glimpses of them through the trees often couldn't tell which twin they were seeing. Then came the morning that deepened the mystery. In early July, Eliza woke to find blood staining her nightgown, her first monthly bleeding. At the very same moment in the next room, Elijah's nose erupted in a violent gush that soaked through 3 of Thomas's work shirts. The bleeding in both bodies stopped only when Eliza's cramps finally eased, leaving Elijah pale as mountain limestone. "What's happening to us?" Eliza whispered, though in her heart she already knew. This was only another thread in the endless pattern of their shared existence. 2 weeks later, the fever arrived. Elijah collapsed first, fainting beside the well, his temperature so high Thomas could feel the heat without touching him. Within minutes, Eliza fell ill too, her body matching his degree for degree. Thomas faced a terrible choice. The nearest doctor lived beyond the mountain, a rough journey for even one patient. In desperation, he decided to take only Elijah, hoping that if one twin recovered, the other might follow. He loaded his son into the wagon and started down the winding road. They had gone barely a mile before Elijah began to convulse, eyes rolling back until only the whites showed blood-tinged foam at his mouth. Panicked, Thomas whipped the mule around, driving harder than he had in years. When he burst back into the cabin, he found Eliza in the same state, rigid, seizing breathless. But the instant he laid Elijah beside his sister, both twins relaxed their bodies, softening at once as though a single storm had passed through them together. Tell me, listener, if you were Thomas, what would you believe now? 2 children bound by love, or one soul split in defiance of nature, refusing to be apart. Their breathing fell into perfect rhythm. The fevers broke at the very same instant. And when their eyes opened, it was as though a single gaze looked out from 2 faces. "We cannot be separated," they said together, voices carrying a certainty that chilled Thomas despite the heavy summer heat. 3 days later, a stranger arrived, a young physician named Dr. William Marsh, newly trained in Charleston, his mind sharpened by modern medicine and an open disdain for mountain superstitions. But skepticism can die quickly in Cedar Hollow. Within an hour of examining the twins, Dr. Marsh's confidence began to crumble. "This is impossible," he muttered, checking and rechecking his instruments. Their heartbeats, perfectly synchronized. When I take one pulse, I feel it echo in the other. When I look into Eliza's throat, Elijah opens his mouth without prompting. He tested again and again. A pinprick to Elijah's finger made Eliza flinch. When Dr. Marsh asked Eliza to close her eyes and touch her nose, Elijah performed the motion in perfect silence without being asked. Most unsettling of all, when the doctor pressed his stethoscope to either chest, he heard both heartbeats as if their hearts called and answered across the space between them. In all my studies, Dr. Marsh told Thomas privately, his voice low, "I have never encountered anything like this. It is as if they share a nervous system despite inhabiting separate bodies. They should be studied at a proper facility, but..." He glanced toward the shadowed mountains outside. "I fear what might happen if anyone tries to take them from this place." Before leaving, the young doctor gave Thomas a leather-bound journal. "Write everything," he said. "Every strange incident. Science may need these records one day." Thomas obeyed. With coal-stained hands, he filled page after page how the twins sometimes spoke in languages no one had taught them. How they would stand silently at windows, eyes fixed on things no one else could see. How animals shied away and fresh milk soured if the children stared too long. The fever had changed them. They no longer pretended to be ordinary brother and sister. They moved through the cabin like two halves of a single organism bound by something older than blood. Thomas Whitaker became a haunted man, haunted by the children who shared his roof and by the bottle that now never left his side. As Eliza and Elijah turned 15, then 16, desperation spread through him like black mold creeping across a damp wall. He convinced himself there must be a way to break their unnatural bond before it broke him. His first attempt came in the spring of 1947. The coal mines of Harlan County were hiring, and Thomas saw a chance. If Elijah could be sent to work 3 counties away, perhaps distance would teach them to live as individuals. The morning of departure was heavy with fog. Elijah stood calmly beside the wagon, gray eyes as still as a mountain lake. "This won't work, Father," both twins said at once, though Eliza remained 20 feet away on the porch. "Get in the wagon, boy." Thomas barked whiskey on his breath. Elijah climbed aboard without protest. Eliza stayed perfectly still, her face serene, as the wagon rattled down the rocky road. For the first time, Thomas felt a fragile spark of hope. Perhaps separation would finally free them. 3 days later, a telegram arrived. Elijah had collapsed during his first shift underground. Miners found him convulsing in the dark blood, leaking from his ears. He was barely breathing when they carried him to the surface and sent him home. Back in Cedar Hollow, Thomas discovered Eliza exactly where he had left her, sitting on the porch. Skin the color of ash, breathing shallow and slow. She had not eaten, not moved, not spoken since her brother left. But the moment the wagon carrying Elijah appeared on the mountain road, color returned to her cheeks. When Elijah stumbled from the wagon and collapsed beside her, the twins smiled faintly and spoke as one. "We told you." The second attempt was crueler. This time, Thomas enlisted his sister Margaret, a stern boarding house keeper in Virginia. He told her only that Eliza needed discipline and a woman's guidance, leaving out the darker truths. Margaret agreed to take the girl and teach her proper womanly skills. Thomas waited until the twins slept. Under the hush of night, he carried Eliza to the wagon and drove through the darkness, reaching Margaret's house before dawn. By the time Elijah awoke, his sister was 200 miles away. The screaming began at once. Elijah's cries were not human wails, but raw, shattering sounds that sent birds fleeing from the trees. He clawed at his own skin until it ran with blood, shouting words no one recognized, syllables that seemed older than language itself. Thomas tried to restrain him, but the boy fought with the strength of madness. Meanwhile, in Virginia, Margaret stood helpless as Eliza slipped into a waking coma. Her eyes remained open, yet unseeing, her body unresponsive to any touch. She would not eat. She would not drink. It was as though her soul had simply walked away, following the echo of the twin who had been torn from her. The telegram came on the third day, a thin slip of paper that carried a single plea from Margaret: "Come. Get your daughter before she dies." Thomas read it again and again, as though more meaning might rise from those few trembling words. The reunion that followed was both terrible and strangely beautiful. When Eliza was carried back into the shadowed cabin, both twins began to weep, not the scattered sobs of frightened children, but a perfect, mirrored sorrow. Their tears fell in exact rhythm, each drop matching the other like echoes in a hollow cave. They clung to one another with a desperation so fierce that Thomas turned away, understanding at last that he was fighting something far beyond the reach of any father's will. The final attempt to part them did not come from him, but from a man of God. Reverend Joshua Mills, a traveling preacher known for chasing demons from the unwilling, arrived in Cedar Hollow in the waning autumn of 1948. His black coat carried the dust of long roads, and his Bible was worn soft at the edges from countless battles with the unseen. "I've heard about your children," he told Thomas, his voice a low thunder. "This is the devil's work. Mark my words. But the Lord is stronger than any demon." The exorcism unfolded in the cabin's main room, the very heart of the house. The Reverend ordered the twins to kneel on opposite sides of the wooden floor, sprinkling holy water, reading scripture until the walls themselves seemed to hold their breath. At first, nothing. Only the slow crackle of the fire and the preacher's rising voice. But as he called more fervently for the demons to show themselves, the air shifted. The temperature dropped so suddenly that every breath became a pale ghost in the lamplight. Then, as though moved by a single hidden string, the twins turned their heads at the same instant to face him. Their eyes were bright and unreadable, and when they smiled, it was the same smile on two faces, a perfect reflection. The thunderstorm that claimed Thomas Whitaker came without warning. One September night, lightning tore the sky open like God's own fury, and rain poured so violently that the mountain paths became dark rivers. They found him the next morning at the bottom of Devil's Drop, a cliff notorious for swallowing the careless and the drunk alike. His neck was broken clean, his eyes still open to the weeping sky. At the funeral, Eliza and Elijah stood without tears. Neighbors whispered about their unnatural calm, about how they moved as though one body cast two shadows. When the preacher asked if anyone wished to speak for the dead, the twins stepped forward together, of course. "He tried to make us two when we were always one," they said in perfect unison. "Now he is free. And so are we." After that day, the cabin at Cedar Hollow belonged only to them. 17 years old, old enough by mountain custom to care for themselves, they lived without visitors. The few neighbors who once ventured up the trail stopped coming altogether. There were too many stories now of flickering lights in the windows at impossible hours of a single voice that somehow spoke from two throats. The twins fell into a rhythm that required no words. They rose with the sun, tended the small garden, kept the cabin alive with a quiet precision that seemed more mechanical than human. When Eliza worked the butter churn, Elijah readied the molds without being asked. When Elijah split firewood, Eliza stacked it in perfect time. 2 hands, 2 minds, 1 will. But in the spring of 1950, something broke the pattern. Eliza felt it first, the morning sickness that came like a thief stealing appetite, leaving her weak and trembling. Her breasts grew tender. Her monthly bleeding, always as steady as the moon, simply ceased. "This is not possible," she whispered to the warped mirror on the cabin wall, her palms pressing to her still flat belly. But Elijah already knew. He had felt it too, the same strange fluttering in his own stomach, the same sudden waves of nausea. When she vomited into the wash basin, he tasted bile in his throat. When her breasts ached, his chest throbbed in phantom pain. No man had crossed their threshold since the night their father died. No one had touched Eliza's skin but the twin who shared her soul. The realization came like ice water, and yet, beneath the horror was a darker understanding. This too was part of their pattern. Driven by a terrible urgency, they searched the cabin for answers. They pulled up floorboards, opened trunks, until at last, in a rusted metal box beneath their parents' marriage bed, they found what had always been waiting: yellowed papers, ink faded to brown, a family tree that twisted back on itself like a snake devouring its own tail. Eliza read aloud, her voice trembling. Jeremiah and Josephine Whitaker, born 1778, mirror twins wed to each other in secret. Bore twins Jesse and Judith, who, the words blurred, but the pattern was unmistakable. Generation after generation of mirror twins, bound together, repeating the same forbidden union. Grandmother and great-uncle, great-great-grandparents. Back and back the curse threading through their bloodline like a poisoned river. Eliza's hand found another document written in their grandmother's careful script. Across the top, a title, "The Gemini Curse." When God makes a soul too large for one body, it read, He splits it in two. But what is split seeks always to reunite. The children of such unions are marked, destined to repeat the pattern until the bloodline ends or the curse is broken. "How do we break it?" Eliza whispered, though her growing belly already held the answer. The curse would end only when no more twins were born, when the line ended in death or separation so final that no reunion was possible. They sat together on the wooden floor, surrounded by the brittle evidence of a history too cruel to deny. Outside, the moon climbed high, bright and full, casting a silver glow that blurred their shadows until it was impossible to tell where one twin ended and the other began. Eliza felt the quickening, the flutter of impossible life within her. "They're moving." She breathed a whisper that belonged to them both. The pregnancy moved with a speed that mocked the natural order. What should have taken 9 long months unfolded in barely 6, as though the lives inside Eliza were impatient to step into the world, impatient to continue the pattern that had haunted their family for centuries. Both twins felt every shiver of it. When the babies kicked, Elijah would double over his hands, clutching his own flat stomach, as if some phantom foot pressed from within. When Eliza's ankles swelled, his own feet ached and burned, and the dreams. Every night without fail they slipped into the same vivid visions. They saw themselves as infants, two halves of a single whole, reaching for each other across the narrow space between their baskets. They saw their parents, their grandparents, mirror twins, stretching back through time like a hall of endless reflections. Each pair locked in the same eternal dance of separation and reunion, as if the soul itself were trapped in a loop that could never be broken. It was during the 4th month that Granny Morrison appeared at their door. No one could say where she lived or even how long she had been alive. Her face was a map of deep, wandering wrinkles. Her eyes cloudy with cataracts, yet somehow piercing. She simply arrived when the mountains decided she was needed, bringing knowledge that most folk prayed never to hear. "I knew your grandmother," she said, lowering herself by the fire without so much as an invitation. "Knew her brother too. Watched them fight the same fight you're fighting now. They thought they could resist it. Thought love between siblings was a sin God would punish. But child," she leaned forward, "this ain't about God. And it sure ain't about sin. This is older than either of them." Eliza poured the old woman a cup of tea, her hands trembling. Her belly was already round, far too round for just 4 months, and inside the restless movement never stopped. "What is it then?" Elijah asked softly, his voice heavy with all the fears they had never dared to speak aloud. Granny Morrison's blind eyes seemed to see straight through them. "Your family carries the Gemini curse," she said, each word slow and deliberate. "Started way back when these mountains were still young. A Cherokee medicine man fell in love with a white settler woman. Their love was forbidden, so they begged the spirits to make them one person, thinking it would let them be together forever." The old woman gave a dry, leaf-like laugh. "The spirits. They got a sense of humor. They made them one soul but kept them in 2 bodies. Every generation, since that soul splits again, always reaching, always trying to become whole." Eliza's hands slid protectively over her swollen belly. "How do we stop it?" she whispered. "Stop it." Granny Morrison shook her head, the sound of her cackle like brittle twigs snapping in frost. "Child, you can't stop the sun from rising. This is what you are. 2 bodies, 1 soul, and the babies you carry, they're the next split. Each generation the bond grows stronger and the separation grows harder." From her worn leather bag, the old woman drew a small jar of white salve, its scent sharp with mountain herbs. "Rub this on your belly when the pains start. It'll help bring them into the world. They're eager, these 2. They already know their purpose." When Granny Morrison finally disappeared back into the cold evening, the twins sat in silence, each breath a mirror of the other. Outside, the November wind howled, rattling the shutters, as if the mountains themselves were whispering old truths. That night, their shared dreams grew sharper than ever. They saw their unborn children, a boy and a girl with matching faces, growing at a speed that mocked the calendar. They saw themselves aging quickly, their very life force flowing into the next generation. like water down a steep ravine. The cycle continued inevitable as the tide. Elijah began preparing for the birth with the same quiet certainty that guided all their shared rituals. He gathered clean cloths, boiled water, and readied the bed. His body rehearsed for a labor it would never directly endure, but would feel in every detail. "I'll be with you," he promised Eliza, as her time drew near. Every pain, every push. "We'll bring them into the world together." Eliza nodded, her grey eyes locking onto his identical ones. "They're ours," she said simply. "Both of ours, made from one soul that should never have been split." The babies shifted inside her, a sudden kick that made both twins gasp, their bodies reacting as one. Outside, the November wind carried the sharp scent of coming snow. Very soon, too soon, the next generation of mirror twins would enter the world, and the pattern would begin again. In her belly, Eliza could feel them already reaching for each other, practicing the eternal ache of being two when they were always meant to be one. December arrived with the blizzard that mountain folk would speak of for decades. Snow fell thick and fast, smothering the daylight, turning noon into a ghostly twilight. The wind screamed through Cedar Hollow like the restless voices of every Whitaker ghost. It was in this storm, cut off from any hope of help, that Eliza's labor began. The first contraction struck like a lightning bolt, shared between two bodies. Eliza doubled over at the kitchen table, and across the room, Elijah collapsed beside the fireplace, their cries blending into a single low note of primal pain. It was happening, just as Granny Morrison had promised. A birth to be carried by two bodies, defying everything natural and holy. "It's time," they whispered together, their voices tight with pain, but certain as the turning of the moon. They had prepared as best they could. The bed upstairs was layered with clean sheets, boiled 3 times in scalding water. A kettle hissed on the stove, and the jar of white salve Granny Morrison had left sat waiting on the table. But no amount of boiling, no whispered prayer could prepare them for what was about to unfold. The contractions built like waves, each one stronger, darker, dragging them both towards some ancient shore. Elijah felt every tightening of muscles he did not possess, every tearing surge of pain from organs he had never known. His body twisted with sympathetic agony, sweat soaking his shirt as he coached his sister through the breathing they both needed to survive. "I see them," Eliza gasped during a fleeting lull between pains. "In my mind, I see them reaching for each other." The labor came, fast hours collapsing into minutes. The twins moved together in a rhythm older than language. Elijah braced her when she needed to stand, both of them, knowing without a word when to push, when to rest, when to breathe. And then, as the first child crowned, the strangest thing happened. The wind outside, which had howled like a chorus of ghosts for hours, suddenly stopped. The silence was so deep it felt as though the world itself had paused to listen. In that impossible stillness, the first baby was born. A girl, perfect in every way except for her eyes. They were grey like her parents, but held an alertness no newborn should possess. She did not cry. Instead, she turned her tiny head, searching, seeking. "She needs her brother," Elijah whispered, his own body still racked with phantom pain. The second baby came swiftly, as if unwilling to be apart even for a heartbeat. A boy identical to his sister, down to the small birthmark on their left shoulders. The moment he emerged, both infants reached for each other, their hands finding one another with a coordination that raised the hair along their parents' necks. When their tiny fingers met, both babies smiled. Not the blind reflex of the newborn, but something conscious, deliberate, relieved. Outside the wind returned, but softer now, its howl transformed into something that almost sounded like a lullaby. Thomas and Agnes Eliza whispered, naming them for the parents who had begun this haunted line. They already know each other. Elijah cut the cords with trembling hands, noting how the baby's breathing matched perfectly two chests, rising and falling as one. He cleaned them, wrapped them in warm blankets, but they fussed until he placed them side by side, their small hands clasped between them. A final wave of shared pain brought the afterbirth, and then it was done. Eliza lay back, exhausted, her face pale and luminous, already touched by the rapid aging Granny Morrison had warned them about. Lines traced across Elijah's eyes as well, etched there by hours rather than years. "Look at them," Eliza whispered. "They're more connected than we ever were. Each generation, the bond grows stronger." And it was true. Where Eliza and Elijah had learned their strange unity over years, these babies were born knowing. They moved in perfect mirror, each tiny gesture reflected instantly in the other. When Agnes yawned, Thomas yawned. When Thomas stretched a fist, Agnes stretched hers. As the night deepened and the blizzard softened its furious song, the new parents took turns holding their impossible children. But the babies would only settle if they could see each other, would only nurse if they were touching. Already, the pattern was claiming them. "We've continued it," Elijah murmured, his voice heavy with a sorrow older than the mountains. Eliza could only nod, too tired to fight the truth. In her arms, baby Agnes opened her knowing grey eyes and stared into her mother's face with an expression that seemed to say, "We understand. We accept. We are what we were meant to be." The cycle had turned again. The years that followed slipped past like pages torn from a book and scattered on a winter wind. Time moved differently in Cedar Hollow, especially for the Whittaker twins. As their children grew with impossible speed, Eliza and Elijah aged at twice the normal rate. By the time Thomas and Agnes celebrated their first birthday, their parents looked as though a decade had passed. The children were extraordinary from the start. They walked at 6 months, their tiny steps perfectly synchronized, as if they were dancers following an invisible choreography. They spoke at 8 months, but their first words were not "Mama" or "Papa." Instead, they looked at each other and said together, soft, certain, and airy as moonlight, "We remember." And from that moment on, every stitch of clothing, every breath of mountain air, every quiet night in the cabin belonged to the next turn of the Whittaker curse. The years slipped across Cedar Hollow like mist curling between the pines. Thomas and Agnes, those impossible children, grew in a way that unsettled even the most weathered eyes. At birth, their features had been striking enough. But as the seasons passed, those features sharpened, refined, and became almost too perfect, too symmetrical. Beautiful, yes, but in a way that made neighbors glance twice, then turn away with a shiver. Sometimes a hunter or a wandering lumberman would catch sight of them through the trees, only to swear later that he'd seen one child in two places at once. A single grey-eyed figure darting across the clearing, only for a second and then gone like a reflection caught between mirrors. What would you do if you saw a child where there should be none, or two where there should be only one? By the spring of 1955, the whispers had stretched beyond the mountain. Government men arrived in black cars that groaned and scraped along the rutted road, their crisp suits and polished shoes looking almost laughably fragile against the ancient forest. We're here to check on the welfare of the children, the lead man said, clipboard in hand. His smile the kind that never reaches the eyes. He claimed there had been reports unusual circumstances, strange growth patterns. But Cedar Hollow keeps its own secrets. Before the men could even reach the cabin, a fog rolled down from the ridge. Not the gentle mist of morning, but a sudden suffocating curtain of grey, so dense they couldn't see their own fingers. Paths bent and twisted. A single step forward brought them back to where they'd begun. Hours passed, but every direction led only to the parked cars waiting, like patient black beetles. Frustrated and unsettled, the men finally retreated. Their final report carried 3 dry words, unable to locate. Time in Cedar Hollow does not follow the clocks of the outside world. By 1959, Thomas and Agnes were barely 9 years old by the calendar. Yet their bodies had the presence of seasoned teenagers. Their grey eyes, those endless eyes, held a weight that made grown men look away. They no longer bothered with spoken words. Conversations moved silently between them in the flicker of a glance, a shared tilt of the head. Eliza now stooped, and grey though she was only 30, began keeping a journal. Her knuckles twisted with premature arthritis as she forced the pen across the page. She wrote not for herself, but for some future witness who might need to understand. The children are us. But more she scrawled. Where Elijah and I resisted, they embrace. They are becoming something new, something this bloodline has been waiting for. It was Thomas who found the oldest papers. He discovered them in the root cellar, bundled in oilcloth and smelling of earth older than memory. They were written in a broken weave of Cherokee and English fragments of a story told and retold until only the bones remained. It isn't a curse, Thomas said at last, his voice carrying a gravity that seemed far older than his years. The medicine man didn't punish our ancestors. He began a transformation. Every generation brings the soul closer to its true form. Elijah worn thin, but still. Their father managed a whisper. What are we becoming? Agnes answered for them both, her voice soft, but ringing with certainty. One consciousness shared across many bodies. A bridge between what humanity is and what it might yet be. Their parents listened with a mixture of pride and dread. Hadn't they once believed this was merely a curse? Now they were watching something larger, something no prayer could stop. That night, Eliza forced one last entry into her journal. The paper trembled under her failing grip. They grow stronger as we grow weaker. Our life force feeds their becoming. This is the pattern. May God forgive what we've set in motion. May He help those who come after. A week later, a traveling photographer stumbled up the mountain on a dare. No one knows how he reached the cabin when government men could not. Perhaps the mountain chose to show itself just once. He captured a single photograph before terror overcame him. 4 figures stood before the weathered door. 2 elderly, 2 impossibly young, all with the same grey eyes, all with the same face time itself, mirrored in flesh. The photographer destroyed most of the prints, but one survived a single image, like a window into a reality we are not meant to understand. Recognition rarely arrives like a thunderclap. It comes like a slow dawn, a truth you can't unsee once it begins to glow. By 1962, Thomas and Agnes had stepped fully into their destiny. 13 years old by the outside world's count, yet carrying the bearing of 18-year-olds. They moved through Cedar Hollow like twin shadows, 2 bodies, 1 intent. Inside the cabin, Eliza watched from her chair, her own body bending beneath the relentless toll. Elijah, once broad and strong, now walked with the brittle care of a man twice his age. Each day seemed to steal a year from them. The price of creating the next generation was being paid in full. "We have to tell them," Eliza whispered one morning, her voice as thin as autumn air. "They need to know what waits for them." But Thomas and Agnes already knew. They had always known. Still, their parents gathered them before the old hearth, the same room where countless pairs of twins had faced the same truth. "Your children will be like you." Elijah began, his voice cracking under the weight of history. "Each generation, the connection deepens. We tried to fight it. Do not make our mistake." Agnes reached for Thomas's hand. Their fingers intertwined with effortless grace. "We could never be separate, Father," she said gently. "From our first breath we understood, one experiencing itself as 2. Our children will be 1, becoming 4, then 8, then 16. This is the pattern. This is the purpose." Eliza's eyes brimmed with tears. "But the cost, look at us. We are dying, a year for every month. You will face the same." Thomas smiled, his sister's identical expression unfolding beside his. Every transformation requires sacrifice. The caterpillar dies so the butterfly may live. You are not dying, Mother. You are completing your purpose, passing your essence so we can pass it forward. That night, the shared dreams deepened beyond anything words could hold. The mountain itself seemed to breathe with him, an ancient rhythm rising through roots and stone. Somewhere in the darkness, the future waited, inevitable, patient, and already unfolding. Would you linger on that photograph if it came into your hands? Would you trace the faces, young and old, yet the same, and feel the quiet pull of something older than time itself? Sleep well, but remember, some patterns are not meant to be broken. Some stories keep breathing long after the last page is turned. The young twins began to see their story not as a simple chain of births and deaths, but as a living spiral. Through dreams that felt older than language, Thomas and Agnes glimpsed their lineage stretching backward to that first Cherokee medicine man, and forward into a future where the idea of a separate self would dissolve like morning mist. They saw a time when thoughts would flow from one body to another as easily as a breath of air, when loneliness itself would end not through wires or machines, but through evolution. That spring, as the thaw crept across Cedar Hollow, Agnes felt the first quiet ache of womanhood. Blood marked her passage into a new cycle. And across the cabin, Thomas felt his own sudden rush, a nosebleed, that mirrored her change exactly as Elijah had once mirrored Eliza. But unlike their parents, the young twins showed no fear, no confusion. They welcomed the sign as a soft bell calling them further along the path they already knew. By autumn, the traveling photographer returned. Something in the mountain had drawn him back. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps something older. This time he carried a new camera, one that promised sharper images, truer light. But when he developed the plates, he found only riddles. Every frame showed the same impossible doubling. Thomas and Agnes appeared as a single figure stretched across two spaces, like light caught in a prism. One person, two positions. A truth the naked eye could sense but never fully see. The photographer destroyed nearly every negative in a panic. Yet, he kept one locked away, unable to part with the proof of what he had witnessed. Though he would speak of it only once in a trembling whisper. That winter, as the first snows settled on the cabin roof, Agnes turned to her parents with a calm that chilled the room. "It's time to prepare," she said. "Our children will come soon. They will need guidance that we cannot give once we've moved beyond." Eliza and Elijah, so aged, now they could barely rise from their beds, listened as their children spoke of future rooms to be built, supplies to be stored, cradles for infants who would outgrow them almost overnight. The pattern was quickening. The next generation would be stronger, faster, pushing the limits of what it meant to be human. One night, when the wind rattled the shutters and the moon lay thin as a blade over the trees, Eliza finally voiced the fear she had carried for decades. "Are we monsters?" she asked, her voice cracking like old wood. Agnes knelt beside her mother's bed, her grey eyes shimmering with something both tender and unearthly. "No, Mother," she said softly. "We are chrysalis. Each generation brings us closer to emerging something beautiful, something terrible, something necessary. You began a transformation that will change the world." As 1963 dawned, the mountain seemed to hold its breath. The Whittaker twins felt the pull of destiny like a tide beneath their skin. The circle was nearly complete. On the morning of their 32nd birthday, Eliza and Elijah passed together exactly as they had lived. They drew their final breaths with their hands clasped between their beds' faces, serene, as if they were merely slipping into sleep. But even death could not escape the pattern. When Thomas and Agnes entered the room at dawn, the air sharp with the promise of spring, they found something no human words could explain. Their parents' bodies had changed. The ravaged forms of age were gone. In their place lay two adolescents, Eliza and Elijah, restored to the very age when their own bond had first awakened. 14 years old. Perfect. Untouched by time. Thomas touched his sister's hand and felt understanding flood through them both. "The cycle resets," he whispered. "They return to the point of splitting, to become whole again in death." They buried their parents side by side in the family plot, a single grave for two souls as tradition demanded. The headstone carried only a quiet truth: split in birth, joined in death, eternal in purpose. That very night, as frost glazed the cabin windows, Agnes felt the first stirring in her womb. The next generation had already begun. The following months moved like a dream where days slide past without edges. Though the twins were barely 13 by the outside calendar, their faces now carried the weathered calm of much older souls. Each sunrise etched new lines around their eyes. Each night deepened the quiet energy that filled the valley. They wrote constantly, filling journal after journal with everything they had learned, the visions, the history, the careful instructions for the children yet to come. These pages they knew would be the only guides for the next iteration. Locals began to notice strange lights flickering through the forest. Not the sharp glow of lanterns or the clean spark of electricity, but a living phosphorescence like foxfire grown vast and purposeful. Some swore they saw multiple figures moving in perfect synchrony among the tree shapes that shifted and doubled until when they looked directly, only 2 young people remained. Compasses spun uselessly. Watches stopped without reason. The mountain itself seemed to pulse with a hidden heartbeat. On the longest night of the year, the winter solstice, Agnes went into labor. As before, the pains belonged to both twins. Thomas felt each contraction like a distant echo inside his own body. But this time, the mountain answered. The moment the first child crowned, every mirror in the cabin cracked at once. A sound like frozen rivers breaking filled the night. Shards glittered in the lantern light, each fragment reflecting not 2 faces, but 1,000 possibilities of one soul multiplying without end. Would you have dared to look into those broken mirrors? Would you have searched for your own reflection or turned away before the pattern could recognize you? The young twins sat beneath the weight of their own history, eyes half closed as if the mountain itself were breathing through them. Thomas and Agnes could see it all stretching backward to the first Cherokee medicine man who had whispered his dream of unity, and forward into a future where the walls between people no longer held. Can you imagine such a thing? A time when consciousness might flow freely from one body to another. When loneliness would end not with machines, but with evolution itself. The spring that followed brought a quiet omen. When Agnes felt the first warmth of blood, Thomas's nose bled in the same instant, just as Elijah had bled for Eliza so many years ago. But this generation met the sign without fear. No panic, no confusion, only a calm understanding that their bodies were keeping the old appointment written in their bones. Autumn came with a stranger. The traveling photographer returned, drawn by whispers of a family that seemed to bend reality. This time he carried a new camera glass and gears set to capture what ordinary eyes could never hold. When the plates were developed, he destroyed nearly all of them in a fit of trembling silence, keeping just one hidden away. Because in every single frame a strange doubling appeared. Thomas and Agnes did not look like 2 children at all. But one presence somehow stretched across 2 bodies. The camera had revealed what the human eye could only sense: a single consciousness, divided but never truly separate. That winter, as the first snow sifted down through the cedars, Agnes turned to her parents. "We need to prepare," she said softly. "Our children are coming soon, and they will need guidance we can no longer give. The pattern is accelerating." Eliza and Elijah, frail, now nearly confined to their beds, listened as their children calmly planned for a future the elders would never live to see. New rooms for new lives. Supplies for children who would grow too quickly, who would stretch the very definition of being human. Late one night, Eliza asked the question that had haunted her for decades. Are we monsters? Agnes knelt beside the bed, her grey eyes steady and strangely luminous. No, mother, she whispered. We are chrysalides. Each generation brings us closer to emerging beautiful, terrible, and necessary. You began a transformation that will change the world. When the year 1963 unfolded, the twins felt destiny like a tide in their veins. On their 32nd birthday, the circle closed just as it had been written in blood and bone since the first splitting of souls. Eliza and Elijah died as they had lived, hands clasped between their beds, breathing their last in perfect synchronization. Their faces softened into the calm of sleep. But death in Cedar Hollow never behaved like death. At dawn, Thomas and Agnes discovered what even they could scarcely comprehend. Their parents' bodies had changed, shrinking back to the tender age of 14, the very age when their connection had first awakened. They lay like sleeping children, perfectly preserved, as though the cycle itself had turned the clock. The cycle resets, Thomas murmured, understanding at last. They returned to the point of splitting, to become whole again in death. They buried their parents side by side in a single grave, a mirror's embrace beneath the cold earth. The stone bore only a single line: split in birth, joined in death, eternal in purpose. That same night, Agnes felt the unmistakable stirring of new life. The next generation had already begun. The months that followed moved like a dream of inevitability. The twins, still only 32, yet already graying and hollow-eyed, filled journal after journal with everything they had learned, everything they could feel rushing toward them. Outside neighbors whispered of lights in Cedar Hollow, not the pale glow of lanterns, but something living. A foxfire that pulsed with intention. Some swore they saw figures moving through the trees in eerie unison, though when they looked directly, only 2 young people stood among the pines. Compasses spun. Watches stopped. The mountain itself seemed to breathe with a rhythm older than language. When the winter solstice arrived, the longest night of the year, Agnes went into labor. And as before, the experience was shared. Every contraction passed through Thomas as if their bodies were one. But this time, the pattern quickened. The very instant the first child crowned, every mirror in the cabin cracked as though the glass could no longer contain what it reflected. Frost bloomed across the windows in shapes no mathematician could name. And in the family cemetery, lights danced above the graves of all the mirror twins who had ever lived. 2 sets of twins were born that night. First Samuel and Sarah, then moments later, Matthew and Martha. 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls, yet each identical to the others despite gender. The moment their tiny hands met in the center of their birth circle, a sound rang through the hollow like a bell made of starlight. 4 who are one. Agnes gasped as her life force seemed to drain away, but her eyes shone with quiet awe. The pattern accelerates, she whispered. The babies grew with impossible speed. By dawn they looked weeks old. By the next nightfall, months. Thomas and Agnes aged in perfect proportion, their youth slipping through them like water through open fingers. Yet, there was no fear, only a serene sense of completion. Look at them, Thomas murmured, watching the infants move in flawless harmony. They don't just share thoughts, they are one thought, experiencing itself in 4 forms. Days passed, like years. The children spoke in layered harmonies that human ears could barely bear, their words carrying meanings upon meanings. When they looked at a single object, they saw it from 4 angles at once. When one learned a new skill, the knowledge instantly bloomed in all 4 minds. Knowing their time was short, Thomas and Agnes placed the final journal in the root cellar. The words trembled across Agnes's fading hand. The medicine man saw only the beginning. We are not cursed, we are evolving. Each generation doubles the connection 4816. Until one day, all of humanity will be linked. The loneliness that drives cruelty will end. We are the first notes of a song that will one day include every voice. On the 7th day after the birth, the 4 infants spoke for the first time, not 4 voices braided together, but a single voice emerging from 4 throats. We understand parents. We accept. We continue. Thomas and Agnes smiled, their faces suddenly young again as death began its gentle transformation. They lay down together in the same bed where generations had been conceived, where love had always outrun the limits of flesh. We are one, they whispered in perfect unison, echoing every mirror twin who had ever lived. As we have always been, as we will always be. The children stood around the bed, 4 bodies breathing as a single organism. As their parents drew their final breath, the newborns spoke once more. And we are many becoming one. The pattern continues. The pattern completes. The pattern begins again. Years later, locals still speak of nights when strange lights shimmer over Cedar Hollow. Children who grow too fast, move too perfectly, and know far too much. Sometimes they appear as pairs, sometimes as 4s, sometimes more. But always with those same grey eyes and the same quiet smile of recognition. The transformation that began with a Cherokee healer's lonely wish for unity continues slow, unstoppable, patient as the mountains themselves. What began as 2 souls in 2 bodies has become a widening network of consciousness, a lattice of minds, reaching toward a single, endless thought. Even now, mist clings to the slopes where the old Whitaker cabin stands. Windows that should be dark flicker with soft, impossible light. If you listen on a moonless night, when the wind holds its breath, you might hear them singing many voices, becoming one voice, blooming into many. The sound of evolution slow and inevitable. A blessing. A terrible price. The future being born again and again until every barrier falls away and we become what we were always meant to be. 1. If you've stayed with me this far, you've walked through one of the most unsettling family histories hidden in the Appalachian Mountains. A story that dares to question what we call identity and whether the loneliness of the human mind is really permanent. Do you believe consciousness can truly be shared, or are we destined to remain alone inside our own thoughts? Your answer might matter more than you think.